I want to introduce our speaker tonight, and that's Matt Guilliams. He is a botanist and curator of the herbarium at the Santa Barbara Botanical Gardens. And his focus of study is the flora of California, particularly the Channel Islands, and inferring evolutionary patterns and conservation genetics of rare plants. Pretty cool stuff. If you're a plant geek like me and a fair amount of you on this webinar tonight, I would imagine. Matt earned his BS and master's in evolutionary biology at San Diego State University and his PhD in integrative. What is that, Matt? Anyway, you explain that to us. You can tell I'm not ready. Biology from UC Berkeley. He's been on working as a botanist in the States since 1998. And how long have you been with the Botanic Gardens, Matt? Welcome and let us know, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Ken. Yeah, I've been here at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden for almost 7 years now, so the time really flies. Thanks so much, Ken, for that nice introduction, and Channel Islands Restoration for the invite today. It's really a pleasure to see so many of you here on Zoom to hear a little bit about Santa Catalina Island and the California Channel Islands. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement slide, because so many people have contributed to our knowledge of the California Channel Islands, and in particular have helped me on my journey learn a little bit more about it. And I'd like to start by just highlighting my colleague and coworker, Dr. Kristen Hassenstaub-Lehman, who came to the garden about 3.5 years ago and has been a partner on all of our genetics work and all of our other botany work here since that time. And my collaborators on the Flora of Catalina Island book, Steve Junak, Pete Dixon, Amy Catalano, Mark Haves, and Bob Thorne. And just a ton of island experts and taxonomic experts. I've had this slide in talks before, and I actually just had to resolve to delete the taxonomic expert section because there were so many over all the years. Couldn't have done it without them. A lot of these people set me straight in my thinking, and I've really appreciated that. Funding for this project has come from the Wrigley Memorial Botanic Garden, the Catalina Island Conservancy, and the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. Many of the photos were taken by my colleague here at the garden, Denise Knapp, and so you'll see DAK when the photos belong to her, and otherwise their people's names are spelled out. So we're together for enough time today that it makes sense to give a little outline to where we're heading. So I'm just going to give a very, very brief introduction. You know, if you were visiting the island for the first time and you were exploring it, looking at Google Earth, and then you got off the ferry and you were traversing the island, what you would see. So more of an ecosystem or vegetation community level introduction. And then we'll pivot over to thinking about plants and botany on the island. And we'll talk a little bit about the botanical history of documenting the flora of the island. We'll take a brief stop thinking about the description of the book, just so you have a sense for what we've been working on. But really the introduction to the book is really just a way of letting you know that we're working on it. But I'm going to pivot right away into thinking about the insights that the book, working on the book, has allowed us to gain. And those floristic synopses really are kind of across the whole archipelago. One of my favorite aspects of botany is the story that each plant has. And I think, you know, I mentioned this to Ken, and that was something that pulled him in to thinking about plants too, you know, the endemic plants, the plants that only occur in one place, and learning a little bit about their story. So I'll focus for a bit on endemic plants, and then it would be irresponsible of me to not end by thinking about plant conservation on the islands. So let's just think about the regional setting. So probably many of you have been to Catalina. With how many people go there every year, this, you know, there's a reasonable chance that this was your first island that you've been to. Catalina is just a hair shy of 20 miles off of the coast here. It's the largest of the southern Channel Islands, and it's the third largest of the entire archipelago. The only islands that are larger than it are Santa Rosa here and Santa Cruz Island here. What really sets it apart, though, I've already alluded to, is that this is by far the most heavily visited of the California Channel Islands, with an estimated 1 million visitors per year heading there, in the average year. So just a huge number of people visit Catalina Island. That's very different from the other islands. Yeah, you know, if you're less than 30 years old, you've probably always known a time when you could look at the Earth from space. But this is literally one of my favorite things to do before I go in the field anywhere, pulling up Google Earth or Google Maps and switching over to satellite view and looking down on a place that I'm going to visit. It reveals so much. You know, in this particular case, I'm just hoping that we can focus on landform. So the island here along its long axis is about 21 miles long. It's about 8 miles wide, and it's about 76 square miles. So this is a good size island. Its high spot is here at just shy of 2,100 feet, Mount Orizaba. And one thing that I hope that you'll notice here is that there is a definite channel side. You can see a central ridge kind of running here, and there's a definite Pacific Ocean side. But unlike some of the Channel Islands, there is an extensive rugged interior, and I think that's one of the neatest features of Catalina Island, just the extent that the landmass itself is crisscrossed by these ridges and valleys. And it has 2 permanent settlements in it. If you've taken a ferry there, you've probably landed at Avalon, but there's also permanent folks who live at 2 harbors. Now, if you were there for your first time and you were traversing the island in a tour or a hike, the first thing that would confront you is just the vegetation of the island. And so I hope to walk you through some of the common vegetation communities there in order of prevalence, and you know, in the order of the amount of square acres that these communities cover. So the most common vegetation for the island is coastal sage scrub. If you've been to the northern islands, there's not nearly as much coastal sage scrub. This, to me, helps to align this island more with the vegetation of Southern California. So if you've been to Catalina and you've been to San Diego, the vegetation, in my mind, looks pretty similar. And in fact, the species are often identical between Southern California and the coastal sage scrub vegetation that's on Catalina. California sagebrush, some variety of cacti, variety of sages. So this is kind of a special coastal Southern California vegetation community. The next, in terms of prevalence, is island chaparral, and you find island chaparral in slightly more mesic settings, north-facing settings, slightly higher elevation settings. And in contrast to the coastal sage scrub vegetation, every single one of these is an island endemic. And so Ceanothus arboreus, Quercus pacifica, Rhamnus pirifolia, and the single island endemic Arctostaphylos are all some of the special and very common species that you would encounter in the island chaparral vegetation. Of course, everywhere in California has its share of grasslands, and Catalina is no different. The California Channel Islands have had a long history of grazing of various livestock animals, and that certainly contributes to reduced coastal sage scrub and chaparral vegetation and the persistence of grassland communities. And in the grassland communities, just like elsewhere in California, we have kind of our major annual European grasses like bromes and hordeum and avena. I'll point out that the grassland communities, even the non-native ones, still harbor a fair amount of native biodiversity. So things like our needle grasses and tons of geophytic perennials, bulbs and bulb-bearing and corn-bearing plants, and native wildflowers too. Now, very special vegetation communities across the Channel Islands and also on Catalina Island are some of the woodlands and forests that are on the island. And some of the most special species across the whole archipelago are present in some of these upland woodlands and forests. So Catalina ironwood, for example, a single island endemic species, forms these wonderful little groves that are, turns out, all mostly genetically identical plants growing in these groves. Catalina cherry, Prunus ilicifolia, subspecies Lyonii, and Quercus tomentella, an ancient lineage, is also present in some of these upland woodlands and forests. There's also woodlands and forests down in the creek bottoms, And these ones, as is common in wetland settings around the world, these ones often do not have unique or endemic species in them. So, all of the, if you've been in a, in a creek bottom or riparian area in San Diego or in Santa Barbara, where I am, you'll recognize a lot of the same genera and species there. So, willows and cottonwoods and alders, along with things like Rosa californica, Anemopsis, and various graminoid monocots like Typha and Juncus. So that takes us through a little bit about what you might experience if you were looking just at the dominant vegetation communities on Catalina Island. And I'd like to think a little bit now about the history of people and plants on the island. And it was, it's tempting to start out with the first records of plant collecting on the island, but we'd be sorely remiss for not pointing out that in fact Pimu or Santa Catalina Island is in fact in Tongva Gabrielino homelands, and archaeological evidence suggests that the Tongva Gabrielino lived on Santa Catalina Island for 7,000 or 8,000 years prior to the arrival of the Spanish. So, in no sense did botanists discover the species there. And in fact, our understanding and our appreciation for the biodiversity of the island is probably pretty primitive compared to theirs. The history of Western science's botanical exploration of Catalina Island dates back to William Gamble. And so he made a trip. The actual year of the trip is a little bit in debate, but 1847 is one year I've seen pretty commonly. And Gamble was a collector of plants across the Western U.S., but he collected lots of different things and sent them to colleagues. And I don't have a picture of him, but I've got a picture of Gamble's quail that was first collected by him and sent back. When you look across the rest of the collectors, especially early in history, it's just a who's who of early California botanists. Townsend and Kate Brandegee were out there in 1884, and from that point, several times from that point on. Lyon and Nevin. Lyon was a forester. Nevin was a preacher in LA County. Made an important trip where many first records were collected, and if you wondered who Lionothamnus or any of the other species that have lion's name in them were named after, it was this guy, and Nevin's last name shows up a lot too. Blanche Trask is almost everybody's favorite island botanist, just an absolutely intrepid and fearless botanist who spent a lot of time on the island. She made collaborations with others elsewhere and sent those specimens out, and many species have been named in her honor. Now, strangely or happily, in my case, there have been two previous full island floras done of Catalina Island. One by Millspawn Nuttall from the Chicago Field Museum. This was published in 1923. And then later, Bob Thorne, about 40 years later, did a couple of nice papers looking at the flora of Catalina Island and really improved our understanding. The current project started out with my predecessor here at the garden, Steve Junak, and Mark Hafes, who initiated fieldwork for this project way back in 1995. Although Steve had been out there and Mark had been out there collecting a lot earlier. So Steve was the garden taxonomist from 1976 to 2014, still pretty active as a research associate here, and is widely considered to be the expert on the California Islands flora. He made a ton of trips to Catalina from 1978 through the present. And Mark was at the Wrigley Memorial Botanic Garden for almost 40 years, and he focused on many islands, but mostly on the flora of Catalina Island. So our project, when I got here about 7 years ago, the idea was write a book. We've been doing a lot of collecting. We know a lot. The time has come to write a book. And so we really are basing a lot of the book's organization and actually a starting point for a lot of the text was this wonderful book, The Flora of Santa Catalina Island, which for me is still one of the best regional floras out there for California. But in a nutshell, the ways our flora is consistent with that is we're writing full technical treatments of all the families, genera, species, subspecies, and varieties. We're so lucky to have the book entirely and fully illustrated by Linda Vorobik, who's one of California's, well, she doesn't live in California, but a lot of her work has been in California, one of just the best botanical illustrators. And we've got a pretty extensive front and back matter for the book too. Made great progress on this. We're 100% through the original writing of the text, and we're 95% of the way through botanical editing. And Linda, who has got 137 of these plates that she's doing, is 100% of the way through organizing them in plates and with these beautiful first draft illustrations. And then she's about 80% of the way through going through and inking and putting all of this rich detail in that she does after she does a draft pencil drawing. So look forward to this book real soon. I think we're all going to be excited. All of us contributors are going to be excited to have it done. Okay, well, what is this period of focusing pretty intensively on Catalina? What's it revealed? So this is a comparison of Catalina to the two next bigger islands, Santa Rosa Island at 84 square miles and Cruz at 96 square miles. The first thing I'd like to point out is just this Catalina Island has got the greatest number of plants of any of the California Channel Islands. And if you try to do something wonky, like how many plants per unit area are there, just as a way of comparing them, because they're different sizes, this one's about 9 and the others are between 6 and 7. So that's pretty impressive for a smaller island. The native plants are fewer, however. So Santa Cruz still has a greater number of native plants. And putting those two things together, you probably could deduce that the reason why Catalina has more total plants but fewer native plants is because it has a good deal more non-native plants. And so the percent native of the Catalina flora is 67%, still pretty high. Now, one thing I just let my imagination, my sort of creative imagination go is trying to think about how it fits into broader patterns. How does our archipelago, our Channel Islands flora, fit into broader patterns? And there's a wonderful book that really set island biogeography on its way by MacArthur and Wilson in 1967. And it's about a centimeter and a half thick, but we can summarize it down for the purposes of this talk to just 2 basic ideas. And I have a couple of cartoons here that'll help to show it. So bigger islands will have more species than smaller islands in general. So in my little cartoon here, this is intended to be the mainland. And we have 2 islands here that are equivalent distances from the mainland. The one that's going to have the more species is going to be the larger one. And the reason for that is I could boil it down to 2 easy ideas. One is if you imagine the likelihood of a bird flying over or wind dispersed seed flying over, just a bigger target here to hit. But the other one is that larger islands are more likely to have greater habitat heterogeneity and a greater amount of space, so that there's actually reduced extinction on the islands as well. So the smaller island would have a greater rate of extinction and a lesser rate of new colonization. The other statement is closer islands will have more species than farther islands. So let's take islands that are totally equivalent sizes. The one that is closer to the mainland is going to have a greater number of species than that equivalent size island that's farther away. And the exact same ideas apply here. They just have a greater rate of immigration because it's closer to the mainland. So how did the Channel Islands fit in? So this was a project idea by my buddy Ben Carter, and we have a little paper on this from a couple of years ago investigating. It was really his idea because he's a bryologist. And he wanted to know, Matt, you can be curious about what's happening with the vascular plants, but I want to know what's happening with the plants that make spores. These little tiny things that disperse all over the place. And he really wanted to know, do these same biogeographic rules apply? And so I'll just walk you through 3 potential predictions and how that's borne out. So this line here is seed plants, and you could see just a real nice relationship. So the larger the area of the island, the greater the number of species. But check out what's happening here for bryophytes and ferns. So it still holds. This is still a positive slope, and a very little scatter about the slope. But look what's happening with ferns. The pattern barely holds for ferns. So his idea that that maybe things that are free sporing with their spores out in out in the environment, maybe the pattern wouldn't hold, and he was right on that. Same exact things. Close islands do support a greater number of seed plants. So as the distance to the mainland increases, we have fewer species of things. So both seed plants, and the pattern still holds a bit for mosses and a little bit less, almost nothing for ferns. Now, trying to explore habitat heterogeneity, this was another of Ben's insights. He thought that maybe maximum elevation could be a pretty good proxy for habitat heterogeneity. And again, the prediction was borne out. The greater the elevation, the greater on the island, the max elevation, the greater number of species those islands support. So in all ways, our little fringing archipelago follows basic island biogeographic tenets. Now, what about the floristic affinities? I want to know, I don't want to see a big spreadsheet of taxa by islands. I want to be able to distill some of that out and understand a little bit about how these islands are related to each other. And so I'll bring your attention here to seed plants. Only we'll just talk about seed plants here. And you can see Santa Rosa and Santa Cruz Island here are pretty close together. They're occupying a similar part of the space of this chart, and that indicates a floristic similarity between them. Not a surprise at all. Those islands are very close together, and at times of lower sea level, we're physically connected. But check out down here. Here's our southern islands of Santa Cruz Island and San Clemente Island, close to each other, which makes sense. They have a flora that's real similar to the mainland and to each other, but very different from the northern islands. So I thought that was pretty neat. And these floristic affinities, these are we detected them in that kind of analysis, but we should be able to point to the actual plants that help to build that model, right? And so I just wanted to show you a few of those actual plants. So one of the main floristic affinities that we see is this big similarity between Catalina Island and San Clemente Island. And a great example of that is this wonderful Channel Islands endemic to just these two islands. Phacelia lyonii is one that has this pattern. Another pattern that comes out in the data is the connection between Catalina Island, San Clemente Island, and the true oceanic island of Isla Guadalupe. And that is just the neatest and strangest thing that even though the pattern is ultra clear, we don't have a great explanation for it, because Guadalupe is it's not like you're getting in your kayak and going from Clemente down there. It's a fair distance away. So that would be, this will be a fun one to examine in more detail at some future date. Of course, there's a number of plants that are distributed across the whole archipelago. And a great example of that is the wonderful Ceanothus arboreus. This one is so named here, arbor, meaning tree-like, arboreus meaning tree-like. And this is, if you've seen a Ceanothus, these things are head high or double head high in a big stand of chaparral on the mainland. But Ceanothus arboreus has got leaves that can be, this big, 4 or 5 inches long easily, and can be 4 times the size, easily 20 feet tall. So pretty amazing Ceanothus. Here's another interesting pattern. Another pattern that comes out is a connection between Catalina, sometimes with Clemente, and these spots on the mainland, and in particular the Palos Verdes Peninsula. And 2 species that exhibit this distribution are the just incredibly beautiful Crossosoma Californicum, which is really common on Catalina, a little less common on Clemente, but also is on the Palos Verdes Peninsula. And this is a spot that's quite close to Catalina, and one that was potentially also an island during times of higher sea levels. Dudleya virens, subspecies insularis, is another good example of a species that's known from Catalina and also from Rancho Palos Verdes. Okay, and all of this, what we've been talking about really is endemism. And Catalina Island has got a ton of endemic taxa. Well, let's get on the same page with what endemism even is. So the definition for endemic is to occur in a particular region. And that is, that's almost not a definition, because everything occurs in a particular region, right? But usually what people mean when they say endemic is an organism, a plant, an animal, or whatever, that is limited to a particular, usually pretty small region, right? If we're excited about an endemic plant, it's usually because it's narrowly restricted. Including some like Sarcocarpus trasky that are, this one really takes the cake for potentially being the rarest shrub, in California, down to just 12 or 13 or so individuals in one location. If we add in the number of Channel Islands endemics, these are plants that are endemic to the California Channel Islands that also grow on Catalina, we would add 16 plants to this list. And if we span out slightly to include plants that occur on the Baja California Islands, we would add another 10. So 35 or so plants who are wholly endemic to Catalina or to the islands off our coast. Really an amazing amount of endemism. So I'd like to take a step back and just elaborate a little bit on on a couple of different forms of endemism. And these are just general categories that botanists like to use depending upon the process that generated the endemic plant. And these two kinds are Neoendimism and Paleoendemism. And I've got a couple of cartoons here that I'll show that try to get at this. So in Neoendemism, we really have the condition of a plant that's adapting to the local conditions in a particular area. And if those conditions are disjunct in space from other members of the same species, given enough time, maybe speciation will happen. And this is often a recent event, which is where the neo or new comes from. So let's say we have a species on our hypothetical mainland here, and it gets out to the islands on the in the gut of a bird or on a breeze. We would have the plant on the mainland and on our one island. And let's say that once it's on the archipelago, other features carry it to other islands. Given enough time, those plants may each become their own species or their own new kind of plant, off on their own distinct evolutionary trajectories. And what we'd be left with is a mainland plant and 3 plants that are descended from the common ancestor with that mainland plant. Okay, paleoendemism is a totally different beast. So paleo, of course, meaning old, is a kind of endemism that results from the contraction of the range of a broadly distributed plant over time. And speciation does not have to be involved in this at all. And this is often an ancient event, or that has its roots in ancient history, millions of years ago. From a geologic perspective, that's just a drop in the bucket. But for plants in California, 15 million years is a long time ago. So here's how this works. So let's say that we have a real broadly distributed thing all over on the mainland, and something happens. Let's say that climate begins changing from the mid-Miocene thermal optimum. That plant is no longer happy on the mainland, and it's not finding conditions that allow it to thrive there, reproduce, and grow, and its range starts to shrink. So now it's just in a narrow band along the coast. It's still on the islands. Let's say it was even lost from an island here, and in present day, it is restricted to just a few islands. And you can see how this could happen. And so these are why these organisms are often called relics, because they are just the last little remnants of a formerly widespread thing. Okay, so let's talk about a few of the neoendemics that are ones that have captured my imagination and that I think a lot of people care about. And I want to start with Malva asurgenta Flora. So this is island mallow, just one of the most heartbreakingly beautiful plants from these islands. Got the great big hibiscus-like flowers. Does really great in a garden. So likely a number of you on here have grown this plant before. A great hummingbird plant and produces blossoms year round. So just a great one for your yard. Also a great one on the Channel Islands. Right now, Malva asurgenta Flora has 2 recognized subspecies. It's got a subspecies that is restricted to the northern Channel Islands, that's present really in just a few hundred individuals on San Miguel Island, and has been introduced from naturally occurring plants on East Anacapa. It's present just on 2 islands. And we have a southern form, subspecies glabra, that is known from Catalina Island and from Clemente. So we wanted to know if this particular pattern was borne out with molecular data.
Hey Matt, I just want to interrupt. Someone in the chat wants to know if Bristlecone Pines would be an example of Paleo Endemism. I'm not sure if you would know that or not.
Yeah, Bristlecone Pines, I don't know. I mean, each individual plant is certainly quite old, which is what they're famous for. Their long-livedness. But I actually don't know how closely related they would be to, or if they were formerly much more broadly distributed. And so that's really the key thing for paleoendemism, is that you have a plant that has a very narrow present-day distribution, but was formerly very widespread. And so yeah, for bristlecone pines, I know they're quite long-lived, and often for that reason are referred to as each individual plant's kind of a relic on its own. But I don't know if the pattern I'm describing holds for that. That's a really good question. I'm sure someone on here knows and can share when we get to the Q&A.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yep. Okay, so we were curious if this Northern Island, Southern Island split would be borne out by sequence data, by genetic data. And these were the results that we got. So we were evaluating the hypothesis of neoendemism here and the support for these two taxa, these two kinds of plants. And what we found, this line here is showing, is delimiting the Southern Channel Islands from the Northern Channel Islands. So these are all samples of subspecies Acergenta flora from everywhere that it occurs. But the other thing that we found that was pretty cool was a ton of genetic differentiation between Clemente and Catalina, which suggests differentiation in these southern islands too, which was really exciting. And that pattern was borne out when we looked at lots of different kinds of evidence. So you don't need to know anything about genetics here. Just soften your gaze and kind of see if you're seeing three groups here. So there's a Northern Channel Islands group, a Santa Catalina Islands group, and a San Clemente Island group. The same thing here. If you see three big blocks of color, then you're seeing the right pattern. So that was really cool. There was a bunch of novel biodiversity that was hiding in plain sight, and the focus on the Catalina flora allowed us to dig in a little bit deeper here using genetic tools. And I'm just taking a pause here with this beautiful photo of an island fox. I pretty much try to use this in every single one of my talks because it's it's just a beautiful reminder of the beauty that's out there on Earth. And a good way to stoke our spirits before we move on to the next slide. Hand in hand with endemism, because we're talking about things that are narrowly distributed, and we're here in California, and it's a time of great change for biodiversity. We're also talking about things that are under threat. And on Catalina Island, if we describe that, if we split Clemente out from it, and it becomes a single island endemic, it's a dire situation. This is a plant that on Catalina Island is only known from two natural locations. I've been to both of these. Bird Rock, where we counted about 100 to 150 plants in this patch of cholla here. You should know that at a king tide with a great big wave, this could potentially be underwater, and with potentially disastrous effects for those 150 plants. The other place it occurs is just northwest of the isthmus on Catalina, on the channel side, Indian Rock. And this is a picture from when there were tens of plants here, about 40 or so. But right now there's only about 3 or 4 plants there. So again, this was an example of where floristic work drove us to dig a little deeper. Some new insights about biodiversity came from that extra bit of attention that we paid to it. And now we're confronted with a conservation problem, or opportunity, as it were. Okay, another cool pattern that comes up island gigantism, or island woodiness. And just a super example of that, if you've ever been to Hawaii, you may have encountered the silver swords up on Haleakala. Just these amazingly beautiful, I mean, this is a sunflower, in the sunflower family, just this incredibly beautiful agave-like plant with this huge plume of heads on it, of sunflower heads. Really a bizarre plant. And botanists for a long time were scratching their heads for where this particular lineage of plants fit into the broader tree of life for the sunflower family. And Bruce Baldwin studied this using molecular techniques, and it turns out that these silver swords are actually tar weeds. So if you've undoubtedly in the summertime in California come across Medias and Carpuestia, you probably haven't seen, but all these other Hemizonias and Centromedias and those things. Really a dominant part of our experience as Californians in the summertime. Well, it turns out they're related to all these herbaceous plants. This plant is related to all these herbs. So when an ancestor of Media and the Silver Sword Alliance made its way out to Hawaii, something big happened. And the typical explanation for island gigantism or island woodiness is the mild conditions that are present on islands and the potential for plants to have year-round growing conditions, and often in a large mammal-free environment. So it's kind of like you get to the island and you just kind of relax and you just kind of grow a little bit year-round. And over evolutionary time, you could develop something like a silver sword. So I hope this is not a little bit of a letdown, but we are studying this on the California Channel Islands too. And I think the best example of it, but untested so far, is the woody Gilliam catalinense group. So if you picture in your mind's eye a Gilliam or a bedstraw, and you probably see Gilliam aperini, which is a weak-stemmed herbaceous plant that bright green and kind of trailing down on the ground, not woody at all. But there's these three wonderful island endemic Gilliams that are present across the archipelago. And I know we talked about rarity before. All three of these are CMPS list 1B plants, so very rare. One of them is a state endangered. One of them and the other is a state rare and a federally endangered plant. So this is a wonderful group of plants to focus on. And you could see, a real, honestly, shrubby, big Gilliam plant here. So here's where they're distributed. We have Gilliam buxifolium on the northern Channel Islands, Gilliam catalinense, subspecies catalinense, pretty common on Catalina Island, and subspecies A. crispum, pretty common on Santa Catalina Island. And our questions here are these plants related to each other? Are they an example of island woodiness? And so we got some high throughput sequence data to address these questions. And it turns out that we recover all of these together in one group. You can see I've color coded them by taxon. So we have the Clemente group here, the Northern Channel Islands group here, and the Catalina group here. This was I kind of screamed when I got this because it was just perfect as far as evaluating the hypothesis. So we have all of these come from one common ancestor. That makes inferring where the dispersal from the island, from the mainland to the islands happened. It happened one time in the common ancestor of these plants. Now, to evaluate island woodiness, we have to think about, well, was the common ancestor woody? Was this a woody plant? Was this a woody plant, or were these woody plants over here? And so to do that, we compare with its closest relative on the mainland, which is Gilliam hallei. And if you've encountered this one, it's around in the foothills of Santa Barbara County. It is not a woody plant. It's a beautiful plant, but above ground herbaceous, woody a little bit at the base. And so that helps us to understand that the evolution of woodiness happened after that plant arrived to the California Channel Islands, but before they diversified. So just the coolest as far as testing that hypothesis and finding an example of that on the Channel Islands. Now, another thing to note here is that Gilliam buxifolium is nested within Catalinense, or another way to say that is the Catalinense taxa are not each other's closest relatives. So we're going to have to name a new species here, and it's going to be this one just because of the rules of naming things. We're going to have to name the Clemente plant a new single island endemic. Okay, let's think about a paleo endemic. Paleo endemism, again, this is a formerly widespread thing reduced down to just a fraction of its former range. Lionothamnus is hands down the best example of this that I can think of. There's a wonderful paper by Diane Irwin and Shorn that had these figures in it that show back in the middle Miocene, we had Lionothamnus way out in Nevada. So for those of you who the Miocene means nothing, that's 15 million years ago, we had a formerly pretty broadly distributed Lianothamnus. But something must have changed. It's limited now to just these 4 islands. And we want to know a little bit about how that happened. So this is not our work. This is work that was done at UC Davis by Chin during his PhD work. And this is a big, complicated, gnarly looking tree. We don't need to get mired up in that at all. What I want to show you here, this highlighted rectangle is the lineage that leads to Lianothamnus. And it extends unbroken all the way back here. Turns out that the closest relative of this lineage that leads to Lianothamnus is an entire subfamily of the roses, with all of our amazing stone fruits and a whole bunch of other stuff up in here. What does that mean? Well, they did this, they dated these divergences, and you have to go back 89 million years to where Lianothamnus joins up with any other extant Rosaceae. That is truly amazing. When I read this paper for the first time, it was kind of a goosebumpy experience. So that is truly a very old lineage of plants. Okay, so we've talked about, we've taken our tour of Catalina. We've learned a little bit about diversity on Catalina. We've talked about how it fits in and island, how it fits in with island biogeographic processes. We talked a lot about endemism. I'd like to close by thinking a little bit about plant conservation. And I was really confronted with these patterns as I was trying to make sense of commonness and rarity in a system where rarity is pretty common. So I was trying to organize my thoughts on this, and just as a heuristic for doing that, I try to put plants into these categories, healthy or not at risk. An example of that would be plants that are dirt common on the mainland, your California sagebrush, but also really common across the archipelago. So these are plants we're not worried about. No one should be worried about these on the islands. They're doing just fine. The next category, takes a step towards a riskier environment here. And these ones that I've listed here are all island endemics or near endemics. They're pretty common on Catalina, probably pretty common across the archipelago, and maybe they also have a station or two on the mainland. So again, your spidey sense is ticked up a little bit, but you're not ultra concerned about these plants either. These are neat island endemic plants or near endemics. Okay, now we're starting to get a little bit more concerned. There's some plants these are all island endemics, but they're yep.
I'm just gonna interrupt one more time.
Okay.
So someone has a question. Anna, do you believe that ancient human migration could be attributed to the spread of plants from, let's say, Nevada to Southern California?
So that is a fantastic question, and it is absolutely the case that people moved plants. It is absolutely the case, and I think that the best examples of them, and it's been about 6 months since I've had this conversation, so I don't want to give a lot of specifics on it, but the Sork lab out of UCLA is studying precisely this as part of their broader look into the genetics of oaks. And so they're detecting what could be the movement of oaks that are more common on the mainland to the islands, where their signature remains in the genetics of certain named hybrid oaks. So it is absolutely the case that people have, for as long as there have been people have been connected to plants and have used plants for food and shelter and medicine. And so, yeah, it is absolutely the case that at least in some plants, and we detect them because they're often isolated plants or seem out of place where they are. But yep, it is definitely the case. But it's not the common reason why these plants exist where they are.
Great.
Okay, so this next group where I've highlighted Crocanthemum greenii are ones that now we're concerned about them. These are plants that are probably on more than one island, and maybe you're doing well on a couple islands, but have some issues. Dendromecon harfortii was at one time very common. It's not very common now. Or Lianothamnus, this iconic plant of the Channel Islands flora. This is a plant that really is not producing seeds through sexual reproduction anymore. It's it's mostly vegetatively reproducing. And what does that mean for that plant? It's a relic plant. It's it's maybe on the decline. So these are ones that we're watching. Now over here, now we're down to essentially plants that are extremely rare, exceedingly rare. And on every island where they occur, if it's more than one island, like in the case of Dysanthelium or Poa thomasii, we're down to just a handful of places. And these would be ones where, the Catalina Island Conservancy is actively monitoring these to make sure they don't need to intervene, or to intervene in a positive way. The thing that really blew me away in working on the flora was the number of plants that are presently totally not on people's radar, but that ought to be. And my focus has just been on Catalina for this. But each one of these taxa, may be more broadly distributed on the mainland, or may also be rare on the mainland, but is only known from one place or two places on Catalina Island. I already mentioned the Malva would be a single island endemic with fewer than 200 individuals of that whole taxon on a couple of offshore rocks. So these are ones that I added that I was very surprised about, but that could only have been deduced from staring at the flora and staring at the specimens. Now, the last category here are ones that have slid all the way into total extinction of the taxon or extirpation on the island. And the classic example of that is Diplocus Trasky, this interesting little herbaceous plant collected by my botanical hero, Blanche Trask. But to this list, I've added just a handful here of the 30 or 40 that were collected back in the time of Trask from the island, oftentimes in the late 1800s or early 1900s, that have not been collected since then, native plants, all of these. And we've already spent some time thinking about how further investigations using genetic techniques have revealed that oftentimes these plants are special. They're genetic, they're limited to, or have populations that cluster genetically by island. So if these have truly been lost from Catalina, these and the others, what have we lost? We may have lost not just a population of this Amsackia spectabilis, but it could have been, a genetically distinct population. I'm reaching the very end of my talk, but I want to mention just one, optimistic note. Poa thomasii, that I mentioned down here, was formerly thought to be extinct. It was known only from 3 early collections, one by Gamble in 1847, one by Palmer from Guadalupe, and one from Trask in 1903. And it was presumed extinct for over 100 years until it was found by conservancy biologists, Denise Knapp and others, who were doing vegetation monitoring. So again, basic science, exploring, documenting, and describing what we see in nature, turned up this plant, and it turns out now now that they're looking for it, they found 7 more stations, or six more stations, and it's been discovered on Clemente also. So I'd like to summarize, do a 2-part summary here. One of them is just Catalina and California Channel Islands are an incredible place for botany. I hope that the book that we're doing is a good tool for people, a good entry point for people. Catalina is totally on par with the larger island for numbers of plants. Island biogeographic tenets that have been shown to explain biodiversity well on other archipelagos, really explain biodiversity well, especially for plants on our channel islands. We've just got a ton of endemic species for Catalina. It's one of the best reasons to go to Catalina is to see not only the island, but these unique plants that don't exist anywhere else. I really want to highlight that it seems like the more, every time we turn over a stone, we learn something, but there's like 10 more stones under there. So we really need, new work has been fruitful, but we also need a lot more work, basic biodiversity work, to understand this world we live in. Second part, conservation outcomes. Biodiversity work is conservation work. We sat down and just laboriously reviewed every single species. That review revealed a bunch of research needs. I added a bunch of new species to the flora based on older barium records. And I really hope that the actual book itself is a good tool for on-the-ground conservation. This risk assessment, this kind of basic heuristic I started with was really surprising for me. There were a number of possible conservation targets at every single risk level. But what I was most shocked with was in my mind, the growth of the highest risk category for extant plants, adding a bunch of new plants to that list, and then adding a large number to the potentially extirpated plants from the island. But before we let that bum you out, I really want to point out that we don't know the world all that well. And right now, a lack of collecting might be the reason why it seems like some of those plants were extirpated. And if you get out there and explore, you might be the person who discovers the next Poatomacea out there. So I just want to say thank you so much for your attention, and I'll leave this slide here so that I could really emphasize the contribution of my collaborators and funders. And I just want to point out, I am a total plant nerd. I want to know if you have a question, feel free to email me. This is my email address. Or if you're on iNaturalist, I'm pretty active on iNaturalist, especially for the Channel Islands, and that's my username, Matt_G. So thanks a million for your time. I think there might be 5 or 10 minutes for questions if anybody has questions.
Right. Yeah, are you hearing me okay, Matt? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Applause, applause, applause. Really appreciate that perspective on the really not just the flora of Catalina, but of the Channel Islands and how interrelated they are. And it's something that I noticed early on just by looking at plant lists for the islands. You'd see a 2 or 3 or 4 island endemic, and and also how they might be related to islands down or to plants down in Mexico. And you really get that feeling that there are associations, like you were pointing out, just even for non-botanists like me, just by looking at the plant list. It's really interesting. So yeah, we do have a couple of minutes here. If you folks have some questions, this is a good opportunity to do that. Write it in the question and answer window. Let's see, do we have anything, Maury?
Yeah. So Matt, how does the potential extinction of some plant species affect pollinator insect species that may be specific for them? Asked by Miriam.
Yeah, that's a great question. So all biodiversity builds on other biodiversity. There's no such thing. I mean, I think your question alludes to this point that there's no possible way that any species exists without all of its dependencies. So if there was an organism, a leaf galling insect, or some sort of cyanobacterium or something that really was obligate to, say, the manzanita that was on the island, and that manzanita went extinct, well, we're changing things so quickly that one option, things go extinct all the time. Over evolutionary time, that's the fate of all lineages, is to go extinct. However, it happens on evolutionary time. That's like geologic time, millions of years, and we're changing the Earth so quickly that it is not possible for those obligate dependencies to evolve to exploit other organisms or to interact with other organisms. So yeah, I think your question hints at the fact that those critical obligate partners would have a tough time.
Great, thanks. An anonymous attendee wants to know that you mentioned that Catalina has more plants per area, but has a bit higher percentage of non-natives than other islands. Do you think that the percentage of invasives on Catalina could be slightly higher due to foot traffic from the mainland, as well as people residing there, and having exotic house and yard plants, allowing for more opportunity for seed growth?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I would place. I mean, there's really no difference in the distance, of the northern islands from the Santa Barbara coastline and Catalina from the kind of Long Beach, Orange County coastline. That's not a significant difference in my mind. So, I don't think it can be explained very well by natural processes. I think it's got to be the case that the huge number of visitors, and especially the folks live on the island, if you don't know better, you can't really blame somebody for wanting to plant a nice plant in their yard. And so I think that we saw, I think in 2015 or something like that, I collected the first Mexican feathergrass from the island. I saw one plant in Avalon, and that one plant had seeded into a crack that was running down the street, and there was just a line of Mexican feathergrass coming up. And the Conservancy wants to do the right thing. When they detect something like that in Avalon, they go knock on the door. And my understanding is that for certain plants like that one that you do not want to get out of hand, they'll offer a plant from their nursery to trade it out. So, but you're absolutely right that the human settlement there at Avalon and just the huge number of people going back and forth has got to contribute to that. And also that there's roads all through the island, and cars driving those roads all the time. So it's just a part of the history of that particular island, but it did have a possible effect.
Great, thank you. When might the Catalina Flora book be available for purchase? And is there a similar effort to catalog the other islands, either together or separately? Asked by Ricky. I'm sorry if I butchered your name.
Is that R-I-K-K-E?
Correct.
My question for Rike is if there is a lichen flora planned for the California Channel Islands yet. So Rike is our lichenologist here at the garden. So yeah, thanks for asking that question. We're really hopeful that we know that the book is 99-point-something% complete. So the next steps are to, we've had some conversations with publishers, but nothing is finalized yet. So we're well along, and my hope would be real soon. As far as the question about efforts that are spanning the archipelago, there is a similar floristic effort across the Channel Islands archipelago, but that one's still a few years out.
Great, thanks. Karen wants to know, or has a comment that St. Catherine's lace and Catalina buckwheat are an example of island gigantism. Are they neo or paleo?
Yeah, super good question. So when I think of like the most spectacular diversifications across the island, there's 5 or 6 groups that come to mind, and those buckwheats are one of those groups that are super exciting, and they've been studied by there's actually a whole PhD dissertation done on it pretty recently, using molecular techniques to try to understand both the Eriogonum grande complex and the Eriogonum giganteum group. And those are all it's not as unequivocal a case of island gigantism, because their close relatives are also pretty big, and they were woody. Their ancestors with mainland plants are also woody plants. So it is an example of a great big plant on the islands. So maybe island gigantism, but not island woodiness. And to answer your question about whether they're neo or paleo, there was an old statement in some earlier literature on the Channel Islands that suggested that a lot of the endemism on the islands is actually paleo endemic, and that is not true. Almost all of the endemics are neo-endemics. So they've arrived, they're true, California floristic province genera, and they're related to recently evolved things on the mainland. And that's true also for the buckwheats, both of those groups of buckwheats.
Great. Someone wants to know, what is the best time of year to visit Catalina if you want to see the most native plants? Well, I mean, an interesting thing about having a Mediterranean type flora is that so much of our diversity, so many of our species are, they're annual plants. There's a lot of strategies that our Mediterranean climate adapted plants have used to survive the onset of summer drought. And one of those is simply to be underground as a seed, and to not be above ground. And so I would say that if you any time is a good time of year to go to the Channel Islands. I mean, every time I go, I'm blown away by some new thing that I learn, whether it's something that's in the water, the dramatic scenery, or new plants or animals that I'm observing. So there's not a bad time. But if you're looking specifically for plants, then I would, and you're in Southern California, look at what's happening around you. If you're in San Diego or LA County, look up on the slopes around you, and if it's green and flowery, pack your bags and get out to the islands, because it'll be green and flowery out there too. Great. Corin wants to know that she's read that the depth of the channels separating the islands from the mainland affect the evolution of unique species. Do you see this occurring on the Channel Islands in plants and other animals? And I'll let you answer. This is a two-part question. I'll let you answer that part first.
Yeah, so I think the most obvious way that I think that the current water level, the current sea level has affected the diversity on the islands and how the island floras are similar or different from each other has got to be the connection of the Northern Channel Islands in times of lower sea levels into the island Santa Rosa. So I think a big part of why the Northern Island floras are so similar is because they were literally connected, those islands at a time of lower sea level. And I think that's probably the best example.
To each other, right, Matt? Not to the mainland.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good point of clarification. Yeah, presumably all plants on these islands got their overwater, but where there's the biggest influence of sea level, I think is probably the best example of that is probably the connection of the Northern Channel Islands.
Great. And the second part of her question is she's curious about the MacArthur-Wilson discussion. Do the points you made regarding species diversity on bigger islands versus smaller islands and closer islands apply to all species and flora and fauna, or just plants?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the study that Ben and I did was was really aimed because he's a moss guy and he's a bryologist. So for him, he had studied the bryoflora of the islands for 10 years or so, and really wanted to get at is this big natural history difference. The fact that plants reproduce with a big structure, a seed, and pollen has to get around. That's small, but a seed getting around is relatively large compared to the size of a fern spore or a moss spore. And so an innovation for that paper was really his adding his island-specific list of bryophytes and pulling the ferns out. And so, that holds the patterns that I mean, those were the figures from the paper, and it's, it holds pretty well for plants, holds pretty well for mosses, but doesn't hold that well for ferns, the predictions of MacArthur and Wilson. As for other taxa, I don't know. It's a tricky part of this is that the sort of number of plant species that are out there. I mean, plants are the foundations of these ecosystems. So it's kind of hard to know whether things like lizards and birds and stuff would be responding to distance from the mainland or the available habitat and habitat complexity that the plants would form. So it does seem to be the case, for example, that I hope Bill is not on the call, but San Nicolas Island is far out there. And it's a medium-sized island, but it's far out there. And so when we were looking at those plots of islands, biodiversity by size and stuff like that, it's down there at the low end. And it is true that there are fewer, at least, just my own observations that there are fewer animals out there too. But I'm positive that study's been done. I just don't have those data in my head.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe another one.
Yeah, I think one more question here. Let's see. So Lizzie wants to know, can you address the concern for genetic pollution through hybridization with island species and mainland species brought to the islands?
Yeah, what a great question that is. So for everybody, the issue that's raised here, and it's one that exists on the island, it exists on the mainland. It's there could be a scenario where, let's say you go to your local CNPS plant sale and you buy a potted plant of a really rare manzanita, and these plants, really rare plants, are available commonly through CNPS or other nurseries. And you go to your house and you plant it in the backyard, and you live right on the urban wildland interface. And it just so happens that you are planting the plant right next to a big population of some other rare manzanita, and genetic pollution could occur. And basically what that means is that genetic material through the flow of pollen from your plant could get into the population of the rare naturally occurring manzanita or whatever. And this is a topic of a lot of debate. Whether or not the asymmetry in population sizes is such that it really doesn't make a difference, because maybe you're planting one manzanita and there's a whole hillside, thousands and thousands. And in order for it to really matter, the hybrid plants that are formed by the movement of pollen would have to themselves be pretty vigorous and for back crossing to occur. And we don't really see that all that often in nature. So the answer I'm going to give is I think we should be concerned about it, but it probably depends on the species. And for buckwheats, buckwheat's a great example because probably a lot of us who drive Caltrans right away, or near me, there's right in Caltrans right away. Someone had planted, I think Caltrans. Sorry, Caltrans if not, but they planted the Eriogonum giganteum, and it's hybridizing like crazy along a mile or two stretch of 101 on the Gaviota coast with the local parvifolium. So yeah, it's a real issue, and I think that the extent to which it is going to impact local biodiversity really is taxon dependent and kind of situation dependent. If you're in the middle of the city, plant native plants, plant a ton of them. Don't worry about it. It's not going to affect anything. If you're at the urban wildland interface, you should take some care.
Yeah. Hey, Matt, that's absolutely wonderful. There are more questions so we can have time to get to tonight. A lot of really great comments too. People received this very well. They're very thankful to you for your clear explanations and for various other things. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for our first ever CIR webinar. And Matt, thank you and the Santa Barbara Botanic Gardens for making you available to hear about this interesting topic and the many topics that you brought up and things that, like I said, I'm a plant geek that I ate up for a long time and have for always for a long time now, is the just these topics that you were talking about, really fascinating. And I'd like to thank our staff too, Maury Spellman and Lizzie Source, who helped me in 1,000 ways put this together. And Matt, for really short term notice, you were nice enough to help us get this kicked off this month. And even though he wanted folks to put this off until next month, but I guess I'm persuasive enough that he it's nice to have gotten us started here in the first month of the year. So yeah, thanks to everybody. And I'll also say, as I said at the beginning, Zoom costs money. So thanks to donors like you for helping out CIR, so helping to pay for environmental education. So come on back in a month and we'll have another interesting topic for you. Some of it will be islands like it was tonight, and some will be mainland like it'll be next time. So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks so much, Ken. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Matt.